Ethan stepped off the shuttle onto the alien world's surface. The air was dense, warm, and carried a faint metallic tang. He blinked in the unfamiliar light. 3 suns painted everything in overlapping hues of gold, crimson, and pale blue. A group of alien delegates waited a short distance away, their tall, slender forms unmistakable. Ethan squared his shoulders. He was the first human envoy to Koresh Prime, sent to negotiate peace between factions who'd been locked in conflict for centuries. He had no illusions about the difficulty of the task ahead. Envoy Ethan Caldwell. He introduced himself, bowing slightly. It's an honor to meet you. The lead delegate stepped forward, a towering figure whose skin shimmered faintly like brushed metal. Their voice was low and measured. I am Archon, spokesperson for the Council of Elders. This is Zyla of the Sovereign Guard. Ethan's gaze shifted to the second figure, Zyla. She was unlike anyone he'd seen before. Her dark, copper-toned skin was marked with intricate patterns that seemed to shift under the light. Her golden eyes held no warmth as she regarded him. A warrior through and through. I understand you're here to prevent another war, Zyla said, her voice sharp, almost cutting. But words alone don't stop bloodshed. Ethan met her gaze evenly. You're right. Words alone aren't enough. But words are where it begins. Archon gestured for Ethan to follow. Come. We'll escort you to the council chamber. As they walked, Ethan couldn't help but notice the tension between Zyla and Archon. They exchanged brief glances but said nothing to each other. The city around them was a mixture of elegance and utility. Towering spires of smooth, reflective material stood alongside structures carved directly from the planet's rocky surface. The people moved purposefully, their movements fluid and deliberate, yet there was a noticeable undercurrent of unease. Inside the council chamber, the air was cooler, and the light was more subdued. The chamber itself was circular, with a massive table at its center. Ethan took his seat, aware of Zyla standing close behind him. Archon sat directly opposite him, joined by several other council members. We have reached a fragile ceasefire, Archon began, his tone clipped. But neither side trusts the other. Recent skirmishes threaten to ignite the conflict again. Ethan leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. I understand the stakes. What we need is a foundation, a shared goal that benefits both sides enough to outweigh the grievances. Trade agreements, joint projects, something tangible. One of the council members, a shorter figure with skin the color of polished obsidian, folded their arms. Easier said than done. The wounds run deep, and many want retribution, not compromise. Ethan glanced at Zyla. And what do you think? Her golden eyes flicked to him, surprised that he asked. It's not my place to offer opinions here. You fought in these conflicts, Ethan pressed. You know what's at stake. Your perspective could help. Zyla hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Then she straightened. If it were up to me, I'd say start small. Find something they can agree on, something they can both benefit from without feeling like they've given up too much. Maybe then the idea of peace won't seem so impossible. Ethan nodded, encouraged. That's exactly what we'll try. Small steps. The discussion continued, with Ethan carefully guiding the conversation away from the past and toward possibilities for the future. He made a point to listen more than he spoke, gauging the council's reactions, finding points of agreement, however minor. As the hours wore on, he noticed Zyla watching him more intently, her expression unreadable. When the meeting adjourned, Archon escorted Ethan toward the quarters they'd prepared for him. Zyla followed silently. Ethan felt her presence behind him, steady, deliberate. He paused just before entering the quarters and turned to her. You didn't have to stay, he said. Zyla crossed her arms, her face unreadable. It's my duty. Ethan studied her for a moment. It's more than duty. You want this to work, don't you? Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked away. Ethan watched her go, his curiosity piqued. She was clearly more than the hardened soldier she appeared to be. And if he was going to help bring peace to Koresh Prime, he needed to understand not just the politics but the people, and that included Zyla. Chapter 2, Shadows of Conflict. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the council chamber emptied, leaving only Archon, Xyla, and himself. The discussions had grown tense as the council tried to map a fragile path toward peace. Neither faction trusted the other enough to commit to more than superficial agreements, and the air in the room felt stifling, as if the walls themselves braced for another eruption. "I'll review the proposals tonight," Ethan said, standing and stretching his legs. "Maybe there's a way to present them that feels less threatening to both sides." Archon regarded him with a flat expression. "A commendable approach, human, but the problem is not presentation. The problem is belief. Neither faction believes the other will keep their word." Xyla, who had been leaning silently against the wall, stepped forward. "If there's no trust, no foundation, why even bother with this charade? The factions see compromise as weakness. Words will not change that." Ethan turned to her, choosing his words carefully. "What you're saying isn't wrong, but words are all we have to start with. If we don't try, the fighting continues, and neither side can afford that much longer." She crossed her arms, her golden eyes narrowing. "And if trying just buys them time to rearm? What then?" Ethan met her gaze. "Then we keep trying. The alternative is letting the war go on forever. That can't be the answer." Xyla's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she nodded curtly and left the chamber, her steps echoing down the corridor. Archon sighed, breaking the silence. "You've impressed her more than you know." Ethan glanced at him. "She doesn't seem too impressed." "Xyla does not hand out praise or trust lightly," Archon said. "The fact that she continues to engage with you, well, that speaks volumes." As Ethan left the chamber, he found himself reflecting on Archon's words. Xyla's skepticism was a challenge, but it also intrigued him. She wasn't just another delegate. She had lived the war, seen its horrors firsthand. If he could gain her trust, perhaps he could bridge the divide between the factions. Later that evening, Ethan wandered through the city, his diplomatic guard trailing at a respectful distance. He needed to clear his head and think. The streets were quieter now, lit by the dim, multicolored glow of Koresh Prime's moons. As he rounded a corner, he nearly bumped into Xyla, who was leaning against a low wall, gazing out over the city's skyline. "Ethan Caldwell wandering alone?" she remarked, raising an eyebrow. "That seems unwise." He stopped, caught off guard. "I needed some fresh air. Too many voices in that chamber." Xyla studied him for a moment before gesturing for him to join her. "I thought humans preferred noise." "Only when it's the right kind of noise," Ethan said, stepping closer. "Sometimes you need a little quiet to think straight." She looked back out at the skyline, her expression unreadable. "Thinking doesn't fix much. Depends on what you're thinking about." Xyla didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned her forearms on the wall, her golden eyes distant. "I was trained to fight, not to think about what comes after. The concept of peace doesn't come naturally to me." "What does peace even look like, Ethan Caldwell?" Ethan hesitated, considering how best to answer. "It's not perfect. It's not about everyone agreeing all the time. But it's about building something that doesn't fall apart at the first disagreement. A place where people or factions can argue without killing each other." She glanced at him, her expression skeptical but curious. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," he admitted. "But simple or not, it's worth trying for. You said something in the chamber today about starting small, finding common ground. I think you're right. Small steps lead to bigger ones." Xyla frowned, her gaze dropping to the ground. "Small steps?" she repeated softly, as if testing the words. "They'll still look at me and see a weapon, not someone who wants peace." "Maybe at first," Ethan said. "But small steps change that too. They'll see you differently once they realize you're fighting for something bigger than war." For a long moment, Xyla said nothing. Then, to his surprise, she let out a quiet laugh. "You're stubborn, Ethan Caldwell. I'll give you that." "Comes with the job," he replied, smiling. "Stubbornness is how humans survive." Xyla tilted her head slightly, as if weighing his words. Then she straightened. Well, don't let your stubbornness get you killed out here. These streets aren't always as quiet as they seem. I'll keep that in mind. She nodded once and walked away, her silhouette disappearing into the shadows. Ethan watched her go, feeling a flicker of something he couldn't quite identify. Zyla was right. Trust wouldn't come easily, and neither would peace. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward, one small step at a time. Chapter 3: Common Ground. The tension in the council chambers had not eased since the first meetings. Each faction stubbornly clung to their grievances, every suggestion weighed down by mistrust. Ethan had spent hours trying to find any point of agreement, but the results were discouraging. Every time I bring up trade, they talk about old betrayals. Every time I suggest a neutral zone, they accuse each other of spying, Ethan said, pacing the room that served as his quarters. I'm running out of angles. Then you're not thinking creatively enough, replied Marcus, a fellow human delegate. Marcus had arrived on Koresh Prime shortly after Ethan, ostensibly as a support resource, though his knack for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense made him more than that. You've been hitting them with logic and fairness. Try something they're not expecting. Ethan sighed, leaning against the wall. Such as? I don't know, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. Something practical. Show them that working together can get immediate results. Maybe then they'll believe it's worth listening to the rest of your proposals. Zyla entered just as Marcus finished speaking. She looked between them, her golden eyes narrowing slightly. You're planning without consulting the council again? She asked, her tone sharp but not unkind. Just brainstorming, Ethan said. No plans yet. Good, Zyla replied, because what you're doing now isn't working. Neither side trusts you enough to listen. Thanks for the encouragement, Ethan said dryly. Marcus chuckled. She's not wrong, Ethan. They're not going to shift their thinking just because you ask nicely. Zyla turned to Marcus. And what would you suggest, human? That we bribe them? Not bribe, Marcus said, holding up his hands. Demonstrate. Pick something both sides need, a mutual problem, and fix it. Show them that cooperation leads to results. Zyla tilted her head. And how do you propose we do that? Ethan glanced at the holomap projected on the table. He highlighted a section of the nearby transport network that had been damaged in the last skirmish. This supply line is critical for both sides. They've been fighting over it for years. What if we arrange a joint repair effort? Neutral engineers, overseen by both factions. That's bold, Marcus said. It might work, but only if you convince them to agree. They'll never agree, Zyla said bluntly. The idea of collaborating will make them think they're conceding ground. They don't have to see it as a concession, Ethan said. We frame it as practicality. The route is useless unless it's fixed. If they can see the benefit to their own people, they might be willing to try. Zyla regarded him silently for a moment. Then she nodded. It's a gamble. But if you're going to gamble, you might as well go all in. I'll make the arrangements to present it at the next meeting. Thanks, Zyla, Ethan said. She gave a short nod and turned to leave. Just as she reached the door, Marcus called after her. You know, Zyla, you're starting to sound like one of us. She glanced back, her golden eyes narrowing again, though a faint smirk played at the corner of her mouth. Don't get used to it. When she was gone, Ethan turned to Marcus. Think this will actually work? Maybe, Marcus said. It's worth a shot. And if nothing else, it gives them something concrete to consider. Something more than just words. Ethan nodded. All right then, we'll try it. The next day's meeting was tense as always. Ethan outlined the plan carefully, emphasizing the immediate benefits rather than the notion of collaboration. The council members exchanged skeptical glances, but no one immediately rejected the idea. It is true that the transport route is critical, Archon said slowly, and currently unusable. But how do we ensure that neither faction will sabotage the effort? Zyla stepped forward. I'll oversee the project personally. If there's sabotage, you'll know it immediately. The room fell silent. Ethan caught a flicker of surprise on several faces. Zyla's willingness to stake her own reputation on the plan added weight to the proposal. After what felt like hours, the council agreed to the repair effort. It was a tentative agreement, but it was a start. When the meeting adjourned, Ethan and Marcus exchanged a glance of cautious optimism. Outside the chamber, Zyla approached them. "You convinced them," she said. "For now." "It's a start," Ethan said. "One step at a time." Zyla nodded. "One step at a time." Chapter 4: New Ways of Thinking. The air inside the ancient Carishan archive was cool and dry. Rows upon rows of crystalline data columns stretched to the vaulted ceiling, each containing centuries of history, culture, and philosophy. Ethan ran his fingers over a glowing interface, studying the strange characters as they shifted and reformed into patterns he couldn't quite decipher. "Do you even know what you're looking at?" Zyla asked, leaning casually against a pillar nearby. "Not a clue," Ethan admitted. "But it's fascinating. I can't believe no one's really studied this before." "Most of my people consider the past irrelevant," Zyla said. "They only value what's useful now." "That's a shame," Ethan replied, his gaze still fixed on the symbols. "History can teach us a lot about why we are the way we are. Why we fight, why we fear, why we hope." Zyla crossed her arms, her golden eyes narrowing. "And how does staring at ancient symbols help you stop a war?" Ethan straightened and turned to face her. "It might not stop the war directly, but understanding these records might help us frame the negotiations differently. Maybe we can find something here that both sides recognize. Something that reminds them they're not so different after all." Zyla raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "That's a long shot." "Most good ideas are," Ethan said with a grin. He gestured to a nearby terminal. "Why don't you help me? Maybe you'll see something I don't." She hesitated, then moved to stand next to him. "Fine, but don't expect miracles." They worked in relative silence, Zyla scanning the text with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent her life following orders. Ethan with the curiosity of someone trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Occasionally, Zyla pointed out a word or phrase, and Ethan asked questions that she didn't always have the answers to. But as they dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge. "Look at this," Zyla said, her voice low. She tapped the interface, highlighting a series of symbols. "These glyphs appear in every section related to major conflicts." Ethan leaned closer. "What do they mean?" "Roughly translated, they mean unity through strength," she said. "It's an old Carishan saying, the idea that we are strongest when we stand together." "Unity through strength," Ethan repeated. "It's not so different from what we say on Earth. Strength in numbers, strength through community." Zyla glanced at him. "But for us, it's always meant unity through force. Strength achieved by conquest or dominance." "What if we frame it differently?" Ethan said, his eyes lighting up. "What if we remind them of the original meaning? Standing together, not against each other?" Zyla frowned, considering this. It would take more than words to convince them, but it's not a terrible idea. "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Ethan said dryly. She allowed herself a small smile. "You're persistent. I'll give you that." They continued working, each time finding more references to the phrase and its variations. Ethan suggested that they compile these examples into a presentation for the council, highlighting how the phrase had been used historically to unite, rather than divide. Zyla seemed more willing to entertain the idea the longer they worked. As the hours passed, the glow from the data columns began to dim. Zyla finally stepped back, stretching. "That's enough for one day." Ethan nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Agreed. But I think we've got something here. Something we can use." "We'll see," Zyla said. "Don't get your hopes up." "Wouldn't dream of it," Ethan said with a faint smile. "Thanks for your help, by the way. I wouldn't have gotten anywhere without you." Zyla's expression softened just a fraction. "You're welcome. And maybe there's something to your approach. We'll find out soon enough." She turned to leave, and Ethan watched her go. He couldn't shake the feeling that despite her skepticism, Zyla was starting to see things differently. Whether it was enough to sway the council or even Zyla herself remained to be seen. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like they were moving in the right direction. Chapter 5: The Dance of Understanding. It was the eve of the long-anticipated cultural festival on Koresh Prime, and Ethan was in the middle of a diplomatic juggling act. The festival was meant to bring the warring factions together under the pretense of celebrating their shared heritage. As the first human delegate, Ethan's role was to ensure that both sides felt represented, valued, and, most importantly, safe. But no one had told him just how complicated it would be to organize alien musical performances, food stands, and ceremonial dances without inadvertently offending someone's sacred traditions or ancient family rivalries. He was doing his best, but it felt like every step forward was followed by 2 steps back. Marcus, his ever-pragmatic fellow delegate, leaned against a nearby wall. "You've got that look again." "What look?" Ethan muttered, scanning the latest set of requests on his datapad. "The look that says, 'Why did I sign up for this?'" Marcus smirked. "I don't recall signing up," Ethan said. "I recall getting volunteered." "You're the one who believes in building bridges," Marcus teased. "And speaking of bridges," he gestured to the approaching figure of Zyla, who was striding toward them with her usual air of authority. "Your human ingenuity is taking far too long," Zyla said bluntly, stopping. "Raps if you spent less time bickering with your colleague and more time finalizing the schedule." "All right, point taken," Ethan cut her off. "But I could use some help. If you're free." Zyla crossed her arms, clearly torn. "My role is security. I'm not a logistics officer." "But you know these people better than I do," Ethan pressed. "You understand what they'll respond to, what will make them feel respected." Zyla studied him for a long moment. Finally, she sighed. "Fine, I'll help, but don't expect miracles." "That's my line," Ethan said with a faint grin. Together, the 3 of them dove into the endless stream of requests, complaints, and last-minute changes. Marcus handled the more practical arrangements, setting up booths, organizing transport, while Ethan and Zyla focused on navigating the cultural nuances. They debated over which performances should take center stage, how to balance traditional and modern elements, and what compromises would satisfy both factions without appearing to favor one over the other. Despite her earlier reluctance, Zyla quickly proved indispensable. Her insight into the nuances of Korean etiquette kept them from inadvertently insulting key dignitaries. Her bluntness, which Ethan had found so exasperating at first, now felt like a necessary counterbalance to his diplomatic caution. "Careful," Marcus said at one point, after Zyla had pointed out yet another potential minefield in their plans. "You're starting to sound like you actually care about this festival." Zyla shot him a glare, but her lips twitched in a brief smile. "I care about keeping the peace. If that means enduring this chaotic spectacle, so be it." As the hours wore on, Ethan noticed Zyla's demeanor shifting. She seemed less guarded, more willing to offer her opinion without hesitation. He also caught her occasionally glancing his way, as if gauging his reaction to her suggestions. "You're good at this," Ethan said at one point, as they finalized the placement of the ceremonial dancers. "I'm good at following orders," Zyla replied. "No, you're good at thinking on your feet," Ethan said, "and at finding solutions that work for everyone involved." She frowned slightly, as if the idea hadn't occurred to her before. "I've never thought of it that way." "Well, it's true," Ethan said, "and we wouldn't be half as far along without your input." For a moment, Zyla didn't respond. Then she nodded, her expression softening just a fraction. "Thank you." By the time they finished the final schedule, the 3 of them were exhausted but satisfied. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "That was a lot," he said. Marcus chuckled. "Welcome to diplomacy." Zyla stood, rolling her shoulders. "At least now we have a plan. Let's see if it actually works." Ethan glanced at her. "It will. Thanks to you." She met his gaze, her golden eyes steady. "We'll see." As Zyla turned and walked away, Ethan couldn't help but feel that the festival, while daunting, might actually succeed. And if it did, it wouldn't just be because of treaties or agreements. it would be because people, alien and human, had found a way to work together step by step. Chapter 6. A Kiss on the Battlefield. The night sky on Koresh Prime was different from anything Ethan had ever known. Two of the planet's moons hung low, casting silvery shadows across the rocky terrain. He and Xyla sat at the edge of a dry riverbed, catching their breath after a long day of negotiations that had taken them away from the capital city. For once, no one was arguing. No factions were bickering. The only sounds were the soft whistling of wind through the rocks and the occasional hum of an insect-like creature fluttering by. "I don't get out here often," Xyla said, her voice softer than usual. She rested her forearms on her knees, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Most of my time is spent in training halls or council chambers. I forgot how quiet it can be." Ethan glanced at her, noting the faint glow of her golden eyes in the moonlight. "It's peaceful. Not what I imagined when I first read about Koresh Prime." "You expected constant fighting?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her tone. "Something like that," Ethan admitted. "But it's not all war and conflict. There's a beauty here, a stillness." Xyla tilted her head slightly. "You see things differently, Ethan Caldwell." "Is that a compliment?" he teased. "An observation," she replied, her expression unreadable. They fell silent again, the weight of their surroundings making conversation unnecessary. Ethan stretched out his legs and leaned back on his hands. The stars overhead shimmered in patterns he couldn't name, and for a moment, he felt like an insignificant speck in a vast, alien universe. "You know," Xyla began, breaking the quiet, "when I was young, I thought this was all there was. Fighting, being stronger than the other side. I was bred for it, trained for it. I never imagined I'd be sitting here with a human, talking about stillness and beauty." Ethan smiled faintly. "And now," she looked at him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen. "Now I'm not sure what to think. You make me question things." "I hope that's a good thing," Ethan said. "It's different," Xyla said carefully. "I'm not used to someone like you. Someone who sees things the way you do." "Someone who talks too much?" Ethan joked. A rare smile crossed her lips. "Maybe, but you have a way of making me reconsider." Ethan hesitated, then leaned slightly closer. "And is that so bad?" For a long moment Xyla held his gaze. The moonlight caught the subtle patterns on her skin, and he thought he saw something unspoken in her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "No, it's not." Neither of them moved for a moment. Then, almost without thinking, Ethan reached out. His hand hovered near hers, uncertain, before finally brushing against it. Xyla didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled slightly, meeting his in a light, tentative touch. "Xyla," he started, his voice trailing off. He wasn't even sure what he wanted to say. "Ethan," she replied, her tone steady but tinged with something he couldn't quite place. She leaned in, her golden eyes searching his face. And then, before he could overthink it, she closed the small distance between them. Her lips were warm, her touch firm yet careful. The kiss was brief, hesitant, as if both of them were testing unfamiliar waters. When they pulled back, Ethan met her gaze, searching for any sign of regret or discomfort. Xyla didn't look away. Instead, she allowed herself a small smile, her hand still lightly touching his. "You have an odd way of proving your points." Ethan chuckled softly. "I didn't know that was part of the negotiations." "It wasn't," she said, her tone serious but not cold. "But it's not unwelcome." Ethan nodded, feeling a strange mixture of uncertainty and warmth. He didn't know what this meant for their mission or what it might complicate. But in that moment, sitting under an alien sky, it didn't seem to matter. For the first time, it felt like they had something that went beyond their roles, their duties, and their worlds. As they sat there, neither of them spoke again. They didn't need to. The quiet of the Carishan night said more than words could. Chapter 7. Learning to Love. Ethan felt an unfamiliar warmth as the transport shuttle hummed beneath him. It wasn't just the Carishan sun blazing through the wide viewport. The warmth came from Xyla, sitting beside him in her usual composed silence. She hadn't spoken much since their moment the night before. She didn't need to. Something between them had shifted. "We'll reach the outpost in a few minutes," Zyla said, breaking the quiet. Her tone was all business, but her fingers rested lightly on her knees, a subtle departure from her usual rigid posture. Ethan nodded. "We'll stick to the plan. Neutral ground, a short visit. Just enough to show them that cooperation isn't impossible." She glanced at him, her golden eyes steady. "And if they refuse to listen? Then we keep talking," Ethan said with a faint smile. "It's what we do best." The shuttle touched down gently, and the ramp lowered. They stepped into the cool shadow of the outpost's towering spires. The air smelled faintly of rust and ozone. A few representatives from both factions stood waiting, their expressions cautious but not hostile. Ethan Caldwell, one of them greeted, inclining their head, and Zyla, Sovereign Guard. "Thank you for meeting us," Ethan said, stepping forward. "We appreciate the chance to speak face to face." The conversation was stilted at first, both sides reluctant to admit any common ground. But as they talked, Ethan noticed small shifts, fewer interruptions, softer tones. Zyla's presence seemed to help. Her reputation as a warrior commanded respect, and her measured responses showed that she wasn't just a fighter. She was someone who understood the stakes. After the meeting, Ethan and Zyla walked the outpost's perimeter. The tall, angular buildings cast long shadows in the afternoon light. Ethan slowed his pace to match hers, their boots crunching on the gravel path. "You handled yourself well in there," Ethan said. "I think they actually listened to you." "They listened because they know what I'm capable of," Zyla replied, though her tone was thoughtful. "Not because they trust me." "That'll come in time," Ethan said. "They need to see that you're more than just a warrior." Zyla stopped, turning to face him. "And what about you, Ethan Caldwell? What do you think I am?" He met her gaze, surprised by the question. "I think you're someone who wants to make things better. Someone who's willing to change if it means a chance at peace." Her expression softened slightly. "You see me differently than most." "I do," he said simply. They stood there for a moment, the silence comfortable. Then, as if deciding something, Zyla reached out and touched his arm. The gesture was light, almost tentative, but it carried a weight that words couldn't convey. Ethan didn't pull away. Instead, he let his hand cover hers briefly. The touch was warm, grounding. "Zyla!" She looked down at their hands, her expression unreadable. "I'm not sure where this leads," she admitted. "Neither am I," Ethan said. "But maybe we don't have to know right now. Maybe we just see where it goes." Her golden eyes met his, and for the first time he saw a flicker of uncertainty. It wasn't weakness, though, it was something deeper. She nodded, and her hand lingered on his arm before she stepped back. "We should return," she said, her voice steady once more. "The council will want a report." "Of course," Ethan said. He kept his tone light, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just passed between them. As they made their way back to the shuttle, Ethan found himself thinking about what Zyla had said. She wasn't sure where this led. Neither was he. But for the first time in weeks, the path forward didn't feel like a battle to win or a strategy to perfect. It felt like a journey, one they might take together. The shuttle lifted off, carrying them back toward the capital city. Zyla sat quietly beside him, her posture as composed as ever. But when their shoulders brushed, she didn't move away. Ethan leaned back in his seat, the warmth from her presence more comforting than he expected. Chapter 8. A New Beginning. The council chambers were alive with murmured conversations and cautious glances. The festival's success had sparked a ripple of optimism, but the work was far from over. Ethan stood at the center of the room, flanked by Marcus on his left and Zyla on his right. He'd spent hours reviewing the final proposal, ensuring that every detail was clear, fair, and inclusive. Now came the hardest part, convincing the council to sign it. Archon, seated at the head of the chamber, raised a hand for silence. "Envoy Caldwell, you may present your final recommendations." Ethan stepped forward, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He took a steadying breath and began. We've spent weeks discussing what divides us. But in that time, we've also discovered what unites us. The success of the festival showed that cooperation is not only possible, it's beneficial. This agreement builds on that foundation. It provides fair trade routes, joint research initiatives, and shared cultural projects. It gives us all something to gain from peace. He glanced at Zyla, whose golden eyes were fixed on him. She gave him the faintest nod of encouragement. Ethan turned back to the council. I won't pretend this agreement solves every problem. It's not perfect, but it's a start. It's a chance for us to stop fighting and start building. Together, the chamber fell silent. Council members whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of skepticism and intrigue. Ethan felt the tension like a coiled spring, ready to snap. Then, to his surprise, Archon stood. You have worked tirelessly for this, Envoy Caldwell, Archon said, his tone measured. You've shown more patience than most, and you've listened when others would have walked away. I will bring this proposal to a vote. Ethan's chest tightened. This was the moment. If the council approved the agreement, it would mark the first genuine step toward peace in decades. If they rejected it, the conflict would likely reignite, and everything he'd worked for would crumble. The voting began, each council member casting their decision in turn. Ethan held his breath as the tally grew. The margin was close, too close. By the time the last vote was cast, the chamber was deathly quiet. Archon reviewed the results, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. The motion passes, by a narrow margin, but it passes. Ethan felt a surge of relief, though he kept his expression calm. He looked over at Marcus, who gave him a subtle thumbs up, and then at Zyla. Her usual stoicism softened, and she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Archon continued, This is a new beginning for our people. A fragile one, but a beginning nonetheless. Envoy Caldwell, you and your team have done what many believed impossible. The council thanks you. Ethan inclined his head. It's an honor to be part of this. When the council session adjourned, the delegates began to file out. Marcus clapped Ethan on the shoulder. Not bad for a guy who didn't sign up for this. Not bad at all, Ethan agreed, his voice tinged with quiet satisfaction. As the chamber emptied, Zyla lingered by his side. She waited until the last of the delegates had left before speaking. You did it. We did it, Ethan corrected. I couldn't have done this without you, or Marcus, or anyone who believed that peace was possible. She tilted her head, considering his words. Maybe, but it was your persistence that got us here. Don't sell yourself short, Ethan said, his tone light. Your perspective made all the difference. Zyla hesitated, then nodded. Perhaps. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their accomplishment sinking in. Then Zyla stepped closer, her golden eyes meeting his. What happens now? Now, Ethan said, his voice soft. We keep building. We keep talking. We keep working together. And us? She asked, her tone quieter. Ethan smiled faintly. I'd like to see where this goes. If you're willing. Her expression shifted slightly, something almost gentle. She reached out, her hand brushing his arm. I think I am. Ethan covered her hand with his own, the gesture simple but full of meaning. Then let's find out. They stood there, two people from different worlds who had found common ground. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was one they would walk together.